The morning sun was just starting to rise over the hills of Carmel Bethesda when Linda Martinez pulled into the driveway of Clint Eastwood's ranch. She had been working as his personal assistant for almost 15 years, and she knew his routine. Better than anyone? Every Tuesday at 9 in the morning, they would meet in his home office to go over the week's schedule. But when she knocked on the heavy wooden door that summer morning in 2023, no one answered. Linda tried the door handle. It was unlocked, which was normal for Clint. He always said that honest people don't need locks, and dishonest people will. Find a way in anyway. She called out his name as she walked through the quiet house. The coffee maker was cold. His newspaper was still rolled up on the kitchen counter. His reading glasses sat exactly where he always left them, next to his favorite chair in the living room. Something was wrong. In all her years of working for the famous actor and director, Clint had never missed a meeting without calling first. He was the most reliable person she knew. Even at 93 years old, his mind was sharp and his habits were as steady as a clock. Linda walked through every room of the large house, calling his name. She checked the garage. His vintage pickup truck was gone, but that wasn't unusual. Clint loved to drive that old truck around the countryside. What worried her was the silence. Even when he was out, he usually left a note or sent a text message. She decided to wait. Maybe he had gone to town for something and would be back soon. But as the hours passed, her worry grew stronger. By lunchtime, she started making phone calls. First, she called Kyle Eastwood, Clint's son. Kyle lived about an hour away and talked to his father at least twice a week. But Kyle hadn't heard from him either. Then she called Allison, Clint's daughter. Allison was also surprised. She had spoken with her father just 3 days earlier, and he had seemed perfectly normal. The family decided to wait one more day before doing anything serious. Maybe Clint had decided to take a short trip and forgotten to tell anyone. He was getting older after all. Sometimes older people forget things. But the next day brought no word from Clint Eastwood. His truck was still gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. Kyle and Allison drove to the ranch to meet with Linda. They searched through his personal things, looking for any clue about where he might have gone. That's when they found something strange. Kyle was looking through his father's desk when he discovered that several bank statements were missing. Linda remembered that Clint had been spending more time than usual on financial paperwork in recent weeks. He had also been making phone calls that he took in private, which was not like him. Allison found something else that worried her. In her father's bedroom closet, some of his outdoor clothes were missing. His hiking boots were gone. His heavy jacket was not hanging in its usual spot. His camping backpack was nowhere to be found. The family held a meeting that evening. Kyle thought they should call the police right away. At 93, his father could be in serious danger if he was lost somewhere. Allison wasn't sure. Knew how much her father valued his privacy? What if he had just decided to get away from everything for a while? What if calling the police would embarrass him? But Linda made the decision for them. She had a bad feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next morning, she called the Monterey County Sheriff's Office. Detective Frank Collins arrived at the ranch that afternoon. He was a tall, quiet man who had been working missing person cases for more than 20 years. He listened carefully as the family explained the situation. Then he began his investigation. Collins started by checking Clint's financial records. What he found was surprising. 3 days before Clint disappeared, he had gone to his bank and withdrawn $25,000 in cash. The bank manager, Helen Ross, remembered the visit clearly. She said Clint had seemed calm and normal. He had joked with her about the weather and asked about her family. Nothing about his behavior had seemed strange. But $25,000 was a lot of cash for anyone to carry around. Collins wondered what Clint had planned to do with that money. The detective's next step was to put out a search alert for Clint's pickup truck. The truck was a 1970s model, painted dark blue, with several small dents and scratches that made it easy to identify. Collins also contacted local hospitals and medical centers, just in case Clint had been in an accident. 2 days later, Collins got the call he had been expecting. A park ranger named Lisa Thompson had found the missing truck. It was parked at a remote trailhead in the Santa Lucia Mountains, about 40 miles from Clint's ranch. The keys were still in the ignition. The truck was unlocked. Collins drove to the location immediately. The trailhead was at the end of a rough dirt road that wound through thick forest. It was not an easy place to find unless you knew exactly where you were going. The detective wondered how Clint had known about this remote spot. Inside the truck, Collins found a few important clues. There was a receipt from Murphy's General Store in the nearby town of Big Sur. The receipt was dated the day before Clint disappeared. He had bought bottled water, energy bars, batteries, and other supplies that someone might need for camping. Collins also found a folded paper map of Los Padres National Forest. Someone had drawn several circles on the map with a red pen marking locations deep in the wilderness. The circles were connected by a line that seemed to show a planned route through the mountains. But the most interesting thing Collins found was a small notebook tucked under the driver's seat. Most of the pages were blank, but on the first page, someone had written a list of names and phone numbers. Collins didn't recognize any of the names, but he planned to call each number to see what he could learn. By now, word of Clint Eastwood's disappearance had reached the local news media. Within hours, reporters and television crews were arriving in Carmel by the sea. The story quickly spread to national news networks. The famous actor and director, known for playing tough cowboys and cops in dozens of movies, had vanished without a trace. Collins knew that media attention would make his job harder, but it might also help. Maybe someone had seen Clint or his truck. Maybe someone knew something that could help solve the mystery of where he had gone and why. The Eastwood family knew they needed more help than the police could provide. Detective Collins was doing his best, but he had other cases to work on. They needed someone who could focus only on finding Clint. That's when Kyle Eastwood decided to hire Nancy Thompson, a private investigator who specialized in missing person cases. Nancy had been a police officer for 12 years. Before starting her own detective business, she was known for her careful attention to detail and her ability to find people who didn't want to be found. When Kyle called her, she agreed to take the case immediately. Nancy's first step was to visit Clint's neighborhood and talk to everyone who might have seen him in the days before he disappeared. She started with Betty Williams, an elderly woman who lived in the house next to Clint's ranch. Betty was 78 years old and had been Clint's neighbor for more than 20 years. She was a retired school teacher who spent most of her time working in her garden. From her garden, she had a clear view of Clint's driveway and garage. Betty told Nancy something very important. On the morning that Clint disappeared, she had been watering her roses when she heard a car door slam. It was very early, just after sunrise. She looked over and saw Clint loading things into the back of his pickup truck. He was moving slowly but steadily, carrying what looked like camping equipment. Betty said she had thought about walking over to say hello, but Clint seemed busy and focused. She didn't want to bother him. She watched him for about 10 minutes as he loaded his truck. He carried out a large backpack, a sleeping bag, some kind of metal equipment that she couldn't identify, and several boxes that looked heavy. What struck Betty as unusual was how organized Clint seemed. He wasn't rushing or acting confused. Everything appeared to be planned. He loaded the truck in a specific order. Like someone who had done this many times before, Nancy asked Betty if she had seen anyone else around Clint's house that morning. Betty shook her head. Clint had been alone. But she remembered one more detail that might be important. After loading the truck, Clint had stood in his driveway for several minutes, looking up at the mountains. He seemed to be thinking about something serious. Nancy's next stop was Murphy's General Store in Big Sur, where Detective Collins had found the receipt from Clint's truck. She wanted to talk to whoever had sold him the supplies. The store owner was Carlos Mendez, a friendly man in his 50s who had run the business for almost 30 years. Carlos remembered Clint's visit very clearly. It wasn't often that a famous movie star came into his small store. But what Carlos remembered most was not Clint's fame, but the unusual things he had bought. Most people who came to Murphy's General Store bought basic camping supplies like food, matches, and bug spray. But Clint had bought much more specialized equipment. He'd purchased water purification tablets, emergency food rations that could last for months, a portable weather radio, extra batteries for electronic devices, and a detailed topographical map of Los Padres National Forest. Carlos told Nancy that Clint had spent a long time studying the maps that were for sale in the store. He had asked specific questions about which map showed the most detail of the remote areas. It also asked about the best routes into the deep wilderness, places where most tourists never went. What surprised Carlos most was that Clint seemed to know a lot about wilderness survival. He asked intelligent questions about the shelf life of the emergency food and how many water purification tablets he would need per day. This wasn't someone who was planning a casual camping trip. This was someone who was preparing for a serious expedition into the wild. Nancy asked Carlos if Clint had mentioned where he was going or why he needed these supplies. Carlos shook his head. Clint had been polite but quiet. He had paid in cash and left without explaining his plans, while Nancy was investigating on the ground. Detective Collins was working on a different angle. He had contacted the search and rescue team for Monterey County. The team leader was Jake Peterson, an experienced outdoorsman who had been coordinating wilderness searches for more than 15 years. Jake immediately organized the largest search operation in the county's recent history. He called in volunteers from all over Central California. Within 2 days, more than 300 people were searching the mountains for any sign of Clint Eastwood. The search teams included professional rescue workers, volunteer hikers, dog handlers with trained tracking dogs, and even some of Clint's friends from Hollywood who wanted to help. They searched along hiking trails, creek beds, and remote valleys where someone might go to hide or might become lost. The search also included helicopters provided by the California Highway Patrol. One of the helicopter pilots was Susan Clark, a skilled aviator who had been flying search and rescue missions for over 10 years. On the third day of the search, Susan reported something that got everyone's attention. While flying over a particularly remote area of the national forest, Susan spotted what looked like a small camp hidden among the trees. From the air, she could see what appeared to be a tarp stretched between trees and possibly a fire pit. The location was at least 5 miles from the nearest hiking trail. In an area that most people would never visit, Jake Peterson immediately sent a ground team to investigate the site Susan had spotted. It took the team 6 hours of difficult hiking through thick forests to reach the location. When they arrived, they found evidence that someone had been there recently. There were the remains of a small campfire. Someone had carefully arranged rocks in a circle and had burned only small pieces of wood, the kind of fire that would produce very little smoke. There were also marks on the ground that looked like a tent or tarp had been set up, but whoever had been there was gone. The team searched the area carefully but found no other clues. No trash, no personal items, no clear footprints. Whoever had camped there had been very careful to leave no trace. Meanwhile, Detective Collins was having his own breakthrough. He had been calling the phone numbers from the notebook found in Clint's truck. Most of the numbers belonged to people who said they didn't know Clint Eastwood and had never spoken with him. But one number was different. When Collins called it, he reached the office of Dr. Patricia Stone, a wildlife biologist who worked for the University of California. Dr. Stone's secretary said that Dr. Stone was out in the field doing research, couldn't be reached immediately. Collins left a message asking Dr. Stone to call him back as soon as possible. He had a feeling that this phone number might be the key to understanding why Clint Eastwood had disappeared. Alan Foster had been a news reporter for 25 years, and he knew a big story when he saw one. The disappearance of Clint Eastwood was the kind of mystery that could make a reporter's career, while other journalists were camping outside. The Eastwood family ranch, hoping for interviews, Alan decided to dig deeper. Alan believed that every missing person case had hidden connections that most people never discovered. He started by researching everything Clint had been doing in the months before he disappeared. Alan spent hours at the local library, looking through old newspapers and public records. He also used his computer to search through online databases that most people didn't know existed. What Alan found surprised him. In the 6 months before his disappearance, Clint had been quietly meeting with several environmental scientists and wildlife experts. These meetings were not publicized. They were private conversations that Clint had arranged through his personal assistant, Linda Martinez. Alan's biggest breakthrough came when he discovered email exchanges between Clint and Dr. Patricia Stone, the wildlife biologist whose phone number Detective Collins had found. Alan had contacts at the university who helped him access some of Dr. Stone's professional correspondence. The emails revealed a fascinating story. Dr. Stone had been studying California condors, the giant birds that had almost become extinct. In the 1980s, through careful breeding programs and habitat protection, scientists had managed to save the condors from disappearing forever. But the birds still face serious threats from human development and environmental pollution. In her emails to Clint, Dr. Stone explained that the condors needed large areas of wildland to survive. The birds required safe places to nest and clean areas to find food. But much of California's wilderness was being broken up by new housing developments, roads, and industrial projects. Dr. Stone had developed a plan to create protected corridors of land that would connect different wilderness areas. These corridors would allow condors and other wildlife to move safely between different parts of their habitat. The plan was scientifically sound. It would require millions of dollars to implement. Clint's emails to Dr. Stone showed that he was deeply interested in this project. He wrote that he had grown up in a California that was much wilder than it was today. He remembered seeing more wildlife when he was young. He wanted to help restore some of that natural beauty before he died. But there was something secretive about their correspondence. Clint wrote that any conservation project he funded would have to be done quietly. He didn't want publicity or media attention. He had seen how public environmental projects often got delayed or stopped by politics and legal battles. Alan tried to contact Dr. Stone directly, but she refused to talk to him. Her assistant said that Dr. Stone was doing field research and couldn't be disturbed. When Alan pressed for more information, the assistant became defensive and said that Dr. Stone's research was confidential. This reaction made Alan even more curious. He decided to try a different approach. He contacted other wildlife biologists who worked in Central California, hoping to find someone who knew about Dr. Stone's Condor project. Eventually, Alan found someone who was willing to talk. Forest Ranger Tony Martinez worked in Los Padres National Forest, the same area where Clint's truck had been found. Tony had been a ranger for 18 years and knew the wilderness better than almost anyone. Tony told Alan something very interesting. In the weeks before Clint disappeared, Tony had received several reports from hikers about seeing an elderly man in remote areas of the forest. The man was always alone and always carrying professional-looking equipment that was too expensive. For most casual hikers, the first sighting had been reported by an experienced backpacker named Jim Davis. Jim said he had seen an older man setting up some kind of scientific equipment near a creek that was at least 8 miles from the nearest road. The man had a gray beard and was wearing high-quality outdoor clothing. A few days later, another hiker named Sarah Kelly reported seeing what might have been the same man in a completely different part of the forest. This location was more than 15 miles from where Jim Davis had seen him. Sarah said the man appeared to be taking photographs with expensive camera equipment. Tony had investigated both reports. But by the time he reached the locations, the mysterious man was gone. Tony had found evidence that someone had been there. There were small holes in the ground that looked like someone had been installing equipment. There were also footprints that suggested the person was wearing expensive hiking boots. What puzzled Tony was that the locations were connected by animal trails that most humans would never find. Whoever this person was, he had extensive knowledge of wildlife movement patterns in the forest. Tony began to suspect that the man was some kind of wildlife researcher. Alan realized that the timing of these sightings matched perfectly with Clint's disappearance. He was becoming convinced that Clint was the mysterious man that hikers had been seeing in the wilderness. But Alan needed more evidence. He decided to contact Robert Hayes, an actor who had been friends with Clint for more than 40 years. Robert and Clint had worked together on several movies and had remained close even after they both retired from regular acting. Robert was reluctant to talk to a reporter, but Alan convinced him that the interview might help find Clint. Robert agreed to meet Alan at a quiet restaurant in Monterey, away from other journalists and curious fans. What Robert told Alan filled in many missing pieces of the puzzle. Robert said that Clint had been going through what he called a legacy crisis in recent years. Clint was worried that he would be remembered only for playing tough guys in movies. He wanted to do something meaningful with his wealth and his remaining years. Robert said that Clint had become increasingly concerned about environmental destruction in California. Clint often talked about how different the landscape looked compared to when they were young men starting their acting careers. He was particularly upset about the loss of wildlife habitat, but Robert revealed something else that was very important. Clint had always been a very private person who didn't like public attention for his personal good deeds. Over the years, Clint had quietly donated millions of dollars to charities and causes that he cared about. He never wanted public credit. For these donations, Robert said that Clint had mentioned wanting to do one final project. It would make a real difference for the environment. But Clint had been frustrated by how slowly environmental organizations moved, and how much time they spent on paperwork and meetings instead of actually protecting nature. Robert thought that Clint might have decided to take direct action himself. Instead of donating money to existing organizations, Clint might have chosen to personally carry out an environmental project that he believed was important. Alan left his meeting with Robert Hayes with a clearer picture of what might have happened to Clint Eastwood, but he still needed to prove his theory and find out exactly what Clint was doing in the wilderness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos was an environmental activist who had been working to protect California's wilderness for more than 20 years. She had heard about Clint Eastwood's disappearance on the news, but she hadn't planned to get involved in the search. Everything changed when Maria received a phone call from her friend Carlos Ruiz, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a remote research station in the mountains. Carlos told Maria that he had discovered something strange while doing routine checks on equipment in the wilderness. Carlos had found several new monitoring stations that had been installed in locations where no official research was supposed to be happening. The equipment was expensive and professionally installed. Someone had clearly spent a lot of money and effort to set up these stations in some of the most remote areas of the forest. What made Carlos suspicious was that none of the environmental organizations he knew were working in those specific locations. The equipment wasn't installed by the university, the Forest Service, or any of the wildlife protection groups that usually did this kind of work. Maria realized that this discovery might be connected to Clint's disappearance. She had been following the news coverage, and she remembered reading that Clint had been interested in environmental projects. She decided to contact Detective Collins and share what Carlos had discovered. Detective Collins was very interested in Maria's information. He arranged to meet with both Maria and Carlos at the Forest Service office in Big Sur. Collins brought Nancy Thompson, the private investigator, and Alan Foster, the reporter who had been researching Clint's environmental connections. Carlos showed them photographs he had taken of the mysterious monitoring stations. The equipment was clearly designed to study wildlife movement patterns. There were motion-activated cameras, sound recording devices, and sensors that could detect when animals passed by. But what impressed everyone was the quality of the installation. Whoever had set up these stations knew exactly what they were. The equipment was weatherproofed and camouflaged to blend in with the natural environment. Solar panels provided power. Wireless transmitters could send data to receivers miles away. Collins asked Carlos if he had seen anyone in the area when he discovered the equipment. Carlos said he hadn't seen anyone, but he had found evidence that someone had been camping nearby. There were signs of small, carefully managed campfires in areas where someone had slept on the ground. Maria had an idea about who might be behind this project. She knew that Dr. Patricia Stone had been trying to get funding for an ambitious wildlife corridor project. Maria had heard Dr. Stone speak at environmental conferences about the need to connect fragmented wilderness areas. The group decided that they needed to talk to Dr. Stone directly. Collins had been trying to reach her for days, but she had not returned his phone calls. Maria offered to help as a fellow environmental activist. She might have better luck getting Dr. Stone to cooperate. Maria called Dr. Stone's office and explained that she was researching the Wildlife Corridor project for an environmental magazine article. Dr. Stone's assistant said that Dr. Stone was still in the field, but she might be able to arrange a phone conversation. 2 days later, Dr. Stone finally called Maria back. At first, Dr. Stone was cautious and didn't want to reveal much information. But when Maria mentioned that she was working with the investigators looking for Clint Eastwood, Dr. Stone's attitude changed completely. Dr. Stone admitted that she had been in contact with Clint for several months before his disappearance. She said that Clint had approached her after reading about her condor research in a scientific magazine. He was interested in funding her wildlife corridor project, but he had very specific requirements. Clint had insisted that the project be done in complete secrecy. He didn't want any publicity or media attention. He had seen too many environmental projects get delayed or stopped by political opposition and legal challenges. He wanted to complete the work first and announce it later, and it was too late for opponents to interfere. Dr. Stone explained that Clint's plan was to personally oversee the installation of monitoring equipment throughout the proposed wildlife corridor. The data collected by this equipment would prove that animals were using these routes to move between different wilderness areas. This scientific evidence would then be used to convince government agencies to officially protect the corridor. But the project required someone to live in the wilderness for months, checking on the equipment and making sure it was working properly. The work was physically demanding and potentially dangerous. Dr. Stone had argued that Clint was too old for this kind of work, but he had insisted that he was the only person he trusted to do it right. Dr. Stone revealed that she had been receiving data transmissions from the monitoring stations for the past 2 months. The equipment was working perfectly and was already collecting valuable information about wildlife movement patterns. But she hadn't heard directly from Clint since he entered the wilderness. Detective Collins asked Dr. Stone why she hadn't contacted the police when Clint was reported missing. Dr. Stone explained that Clint had made her promise to keep the project secret no matter what happened. He had told her that if anything went wrong, she should wait at least 3 months before revealing the truth. Nancy? Thompson asked Dr. Stone if she knew Clint's exact location in the wilderness. Dr. Stone said she didn't know his precise location, but she could provide GPS coordinates for all the monitoring stations. Clint's plan was to visit each station regularly to maintain the equipment and download data. The group realized that they now had a way to find Clint. If he was following his planned schedule, he should be visiting one of the monitoring stations within the next few days. They could position search teams near the stations and wait for him to appear, but Dr. Stone warned them that Clint might not want to be found yet. The project was scheduled to run for 6 months, and only 3 months had passed. Clint was a stubborn man who didn't like to change his plans once he had made a decision. Alan Foster asked Dr. Stone if she could provide more details about the Wildlife Corridor project. Dr. Stone explained that the project covered over 200 square miles of wilderness. If successful, it would create the largest protected wildlife corridor in California history. The project was particularly important for California condors, which needed vast areas of habitat to support a sustainable population. But it would also benefit many other species, including mountain lions, black bears, and countless smaller animals that had been struggling to survive as their habitat became fragmented by human development. Chris Johnson, wildlife photographer who had been documenting the condor population, contacted the investigators after hearing about the search for Clint. Chris said he had been taking photographs in the wilderness for several weeks and had captured images of someone who might be Clint. Chris showed them photographs of an elderly man setting up sophisticated camera equipment near condor nesting sites. The man in the photographs was wearing expensive outdoor gear and appeared to know exactly what he was doing. He was working methodically and seemed completely comfortable in the wilderness environment. The photographs provided the final piece of evidence that the investigators needed. Clint Eastwood was alive and was successfully carrying out his secret environmental mission. It was a crisp October morning when Park Ranger Lisa Thompson was driving along the old fire road that connected the remote areas of Los Padres National Forest. She had been working as a ranger for 8 years, and she knew every mile of these mountain roads. That's why she immediately noticed the figure walking slowly along the roadside about a mile ahead of her truck. As Lisa got closer, she could see that it was an elderly man carrying a large backpack. He was walking steadily, but seemed tired. His clothes were dirty and worn, but he appeared to be in good health. When Lisa pulled up beside him and rolled down her window, she couldn't believe who she was looking at. Clint Eastwood looked up at her with a slight smile on his weathered face. His beard had grown long and gray during his months in the wilderness. His skin was tanned from spending so much time outdoors. But his eyes were bright and alert, and he seemed completely calm. "Good morning, Ranger," Clint said in his familiar gravelly voice. "I don't suppose you could give an old man a ride back to civilization?" Lisa was so shocked that she could barely speak. She had heard about the massive search for the missing actor, but she never expected to find him walking casually along a back road like any other hiker. "Mr. Eastwood," she finally managed to say, "everyone has been looking for you for 3 months. Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" Clint chuckled and shook his head. "I'm fine, Ranger. Better than fine, actually. I've been doing some important work out here, and I think it's time to let people know what I've been up to." Lisa helped Clint put his heavy backpack in the back of her truck. As they drove toward the ranger station, Clint began to explain what he had been doing during his disappearance. He told her about the Wildlife Corridor project and the monitoring stations he had been installing and maintaining throughout the wilderness. Clint opened his backpack and showed Lisa some of the equipment he was carrying. There were memory cards full of photographs and video recordings of wildlife. There were notebooks filled with detailed observations about animal behavior. There were maps marked with locations where he had observed important wildlife activity. When they reached the ranger station, Lisa immediately called Detective Collins to report that she had found Clint Eastwood. Collins couldn't believe what he was hearing. After months of searching, Clint had simply walked out of the wilderness on his own, within hours. The news media learned that Clint had been found. Television crews and newspaper reporters rushed to the ranger station, hoping to get the first interview with the famous actor. But Clint refused to talk to any reporters until he had first contacted his family and explained everything to the investigators. Kyle and Allison Eastwood arrived at the ranger station that afternoon. They were relieved to see that their father was safe, but they were also amazed by his transformation. Clint looked healthier and more energetic than he had in years. Living in the wilderness had clearly agreed with him. Clint spent several hours explaining his secret project to his family and to the investigators. He showed them the incredible amount of data he had collected during his 3 months in the wilderness. The monitoring stations he had installed were providing detailed information about how animals move through the forest. Dr. Patricia Stone arrived the next day to examine Clint's research data. She was amazed by what he had accomplished, working alone in difficult conditions. Clint had successfully installed and maintained 6 sophisticated monitoring stations across more than 200 square miles of wilderness. The data Clint had collected was revolutionary. His cameras had captured footage of California condors using flight paths that scientists didn't know existed. His motion sensors had recorded the movements of mountain lions, bears, and deer through corridors that connected different parts of the forest. Most importantly, Clint's research proved that animals were already using natural corridors to move between fragmented wilderness areas. This scientific evidence would be crucial for convincing government agencies to officially protect these corridors from future development. Dr. Stone called Kevin Brooks, an environmental scientist who specialized in analyzing wildlife data. Kevin spent 2 days reviewing Clint's research materials. He declared that the information Clint had gathered would change how scientists understood wildlife movement in Central California. Kevin explained that most wildlife research was limited by funding and logistics. Scientists usually could only install a few monitoring stations and could only check them occasionally. But Clint had been able to live in the wilderness for months, checking his equipment daily and collecting data that would normally take years to gather. The quality of Clint's work impressed everyone who examined it. Despite having no formal scientific training, he had followed proper research protocols and had documented his observations carefully. His photographs and videos provided clear evidence of wildlife behavior that had never been recorded before. News of Clint's environmental projects spread quickly around the world. Environmental organizations praised his dedication to conservation. Scientists requested copies of his research data, Government officials promised to review his findings when making decisions about land protection, but Clint wasn't interested in personal fame for his wilderness adventure. Instead, he used the media attention to talk about the importance of protecting California's remaining wild areas. He explained that the landscapes that had inspired his movie career were disappearing due to development and climate change. Clint announced that he was establishing a new environmental foundation with money from his personal fortune. The foundation would fund additional research on wildlife corridors and would work to protect critical habitat areas throughout the American West. The foundation's first project would be to expand the monitoring network that Clint had started. Dr. Stone would lead a team of scientists in installing additional equipment and analyzing the data that Clint had collected. Detective Collins officially closed the missing person case, but he admitted that this was unlike any case he had ever worked on. In his final report, he wrote that Clint Eastwood had not been lost or in danger. Instead, he had been carrying out one of the most important conservation projects in California's recent history. 6 months after his return from the wilderness, Clint received an award from the California Environmental Protection Agency for his contributions to wildlife conservation. At the award ceremony, said that his 3 months in the wilderness had been the most meaningful work of his entire life. Clint's wildlife corridor project continued to expand over the following years. The scientific data he had collected led to the creation of new protected areas and wildlife crossings. His foundation funded similar projects in other Western states. Years later, when people asked Clint about his mysterious disappearance, he would smile and say that sometimes you have to get lost to find out what really matters. His secret mission in the wilderness had given him something more valuable than any movie role: the knowledge that he had helped protect California's wild places for future generations.